All right. Well, I want to tell everybody just a little bit about the textbook that we're going to be using this semester. So this isn't content that you're going to be, expected to remember for an exam, but I think it's just context that, will make reading parts of the book a little more rewarding and maybe be a little reassuring that the people writing your book really are appropriate experts and are really interested in specifically undergraduates learning about this stuff. So this is our textbook, Social Psychology, the 10th edition. On the book, there are 3 authors listed, and you'll notice that I have 4 listed here on the slide. And the reason for that is for the first 8 editions, I believe, of the book, the authors were Aronson, Wilson, and Akers. Then for the 9th edition, they added an author, Sam Summers. And for this 10th edition that they've updated, Robin Akers is no longer listed as an author, but she is, somebody who shaped this book very much. A lot of the words that she wrote in those initial editions are still there. So I think it's important to give her her due as well. But let me tell you just a little bit about each of these authors, particularly Dr. Aronson, so you have a little bit of an idea of where they're coming from. Elliot Aronson is a very well-regarded and influential social psychologist who was an undergraduate research assistant. He had experience even as an undergraduate and being involved in research. He was involved in some of the early studies on cognitive dissonance that we'll talk about a bit when we get to that unit after attitude change. Maybe his biggest mark on psychology, social psychology, is that he really harped on the necessity of having high impact experiments. And what I mean by that is when we talk about methods, next unit, we'll talk about how a lot of social psych experiments involve like talking about something you might do in the future or circling a response on a survey. And those do tell us important things frequently about human behavior. But Aronson was of the very reasonable opinion that you needed to actually have people interact with each other and engage in real social situations in experiments so we can see how people's actual behavior responds to real situations instead of just hypothetical things. And we'll talk later when we get to group processes about one of his ways of testing a prejudice reduction technique called intergroup contact theory. He is one of the more famous ways of testing that theory that has been very successful and happens to be an educational strategy too. So he's a very well-regarded researcher, but he also, maybe less well-known, is a very dedicated teacher. He actually, later in his career, developed macular degeneration. So he went blind late in his career, and he kind of retired from research and teaching, just did a little speaking to kind of stay connected to the field. But he missed teaching so much that he enlisted a friend. I believe he lived in Santa Cruz, and his friend was teaching at Stanford, which is about a 90-minute drive under the best circumstances, I think. And he enlisted this friend to drive him to Stanford to teach a class, even as somebody getting on up in their years and somebody who couldn't see, he still wanted to be connected to teaching undergrads. So somebody who's very dedicated to it. I think that's important in having a textbook writer who is passionate about undergraduate instruction rather than somebody who's just trying to make some money off publishing a book or show they're a master of the field or something. He is very well-intentioned, I believe. So he's your lead author, arguably the most influential of all of these people. But another pretty influential figure in this book is a researcher named Tim Wilson. He is somebody who has been present on some very important papers in the last almost 40 years now, or I guess for the 77 paper when he was in grad school, that's over, yeah, there's my math, it's okay, 43 years. the paper that I have here in Nisbet and Wilson, 1977, we'll talk about that a bit here and there. But that paper basically showed that sometimes when we're trying to come up with reasons for things, we just make things up, and we don't always have as direct access to our thinking and our reasoning as much as we like to think. That sometimes we just do things and we reflect on them later and come up with rationalizations for them. A book that he published, a more kind of popular press sort of book, about 20 years ago, Strangers to Ourselves, elaborated on that and talked about how implicit and unconscious processes are responsible for a lot of our behavior. So he's by no means the first or only person to talk about these things, but he has had some influential work that has been involved there. He currently is doing some work that is pretty interesting, that I always like to mention just to show you that some of these researchers just, you know, when you're an eminent psychologist later in a career, you can just kind of study whatever you want. He does research on daydreaming and mind wandering. And what he does there basically is has people sit in a room all by themselves and just have them reflect on that experience later on. So it can be pretty boring for research participants. And actually, what he found is that people hate it. They don't like having nothing to do or just kind of sitting around. And if you give them the option, hey, you can sit in this room, or hey, here's a little device that you can use to shock yourself. You can give yourself a small low voltage shock that kind of hurts, but is not going to have any lasting damage. You know, so you could sit there for 20 minutes, or, you know, if you want, you can shock yourself. And what they find is that the majority of people will shock themselves at least once. And some people will do it dozens of times rather than just sit alone with their thoughts. So probably tells you something about our attention spans and how tolerant we are of waiting and stuff like that. But, you know, kind of interesting work, maybe not the most important in the world, but fascinating stuff. We'll talk a little bit in the method unit about something called reproducibility, which is an idea that studies should be completed again with different teams of researchers, and your material should be open and things like that. And there, you know, is a controversial movement in psychology right now saying that some of our, or a lot of our results don't necessarily replicate, meaning you can't reproduce them very easily. So I'll get more into that in the next unit, but just to say that Tim Wilson has been one of the people on the side of that debate that says, you know what, actually there's not really a problem in social psychology. And I want to try to plant the seeds and make it clear that there is a problem. There is a problem in science more broadly, that we don't have really good mechanisms for testing things very systematically, and things often are incentivized just to like get publications out rather than build on existing knowledge. So I disagree with our author here that things are like totally fine and we don't need any changes in social psychology, but we'll kind of touch on that stuff a little bit later in the semester, or in the next unit actually. The newest author on the team here, Sam Summers, he's somebody who does a lot of work in stereotypes and prejudice and psych and law. He actually very recently was kind of one of the, you know, talking head interview people they had on an episode of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, talking about jury selection and racial discrimination that comes up in jury selection. So he's an expert in those areas. I think they brought him on to flesh out some of those chapters and talk a little bit about the psych and law stuff in some of the supplemental chapters. So definitely a good addition to the book, more, you know, early to mid-early career researcher, because the other three authors were obviously getting a bit older, so maybe had less time to devote to some of the newer findings. And then finally, the author who's no longer listed anymore, but still has a really indelible impact on this book, is Robin Akert. And she dealt in her research career with a lot of things about social influence and interpersonal perception, and is a really renowned expert on nonverbal cues. So body language and tone of voice, things like that. How those influence social interaction, facial expressions, those sorts of things. So I think it's important to note too that she's a very dedicated teacher too. She taught this very class, not at Hamline, but she taught this very class at her institution for almost 40 years. and as far as I know, is still teaching it. People that are experts not only in social psychology, but the teaching of social psychology were involved in putting this book together. So there's a lot of good stuff to learn in there.